Welcome back to another Patreon tutorial. I am excited for this one. I think it's a super simple setup and the whole technique behind it is really basic, but I think the results are super fun and super cool. And I think there's a lot of fun things that we can talk about. What we're going to cover today are these different scenes. We're going to set up this cloth simulation, then we're going to put some hair on it, and then we will talk about the different types of hair stuff that we can do, and also about the rendering. We'll talk about all of it in one tutorial today. So let's jump in and take a look. So in my base scene over here, I have my perfume bottle as always, and then I have this other geo container called cloth where I've just brought in the bottle and the cap, and then I've cleaned it, I've subdivided it, and I've used a remesh to grid just to make it one solid object with nothing inside or outside. Just like I've done in the previous few tutorials, I've just done it again here. So what we want to start with is a grid, and this is going to be our cloth. And so basically what I want to do is kind of wrap cloth around this bottle, and then I can put hair on it if I want hair, or we don't even have to. So I've made myself a camera already, and this is a vertical camera. It can be horizontal, doesn't matter. We can change it later. But yeah, there's a camera in the scene just kind of looking down. And I'll just keep the same camera that I used in mine. It just makes it a little bit easier. And we can then make this cloth a little bit smaller. So maybe a value of 6 and 9. And what I want to make sure is that it's not in the scene here. So we can also just move it and just push it forward a little bit. And I don't want to simulate more geometry than I need, so I can shrink it a little bit, but I also know that it's going to curl in here once it starts wrapping around, and I don't want that to break it. So the next thing I'm going to do is just remesh it, and I want a pretty high remesh, maybe a value of 0.2. That's so that when it rolls around on itself, it doesn't get kind of like all these funny kinks on the bends. And that looks good. Sometimes it helps to increase the smoothing. It does get a bit slow, but there we go. Now we have very nice smooth triangles that are very uniform, so that's good. And then let's make sure we add a UV with a UV project, and let's just initialize that. And now we have some nice UVs. Okay, so our grid is looking good. We can now add a vellum cloth. And for this one, I think I'm pretty much going to leave it at standard. Let's just check. Maybe I'll lower this, but it maybe even is fine on its own. And then I'm going to add a vellum solver. So usually I go to 4 substeps, but because this is such a high res mesh, I'm just going to go with 2 for now. I'm going to turn off gravity and dive inside. I'm going to add a pop axis force. All right, so the only thing I want to make sure here is that this is in the center of our bottle, which it is, so that's cool. And then what we can do is we can play with some of these shapes. So let's just move this up just a little bit. That's too much. Maybe 0.1, and we can also increase the height. Okay, so that looks good for right now. And what I'm actually going to do here is let's just reduce this as we play around, and you'll also then see kind of the errors that you get with such a low res mesh, and then we can bump it up when we get to the final. So for the orbit speed, I'm going to set it at 6, 1.5, and 8. And actually, let's set these at 0, and I'll show you what each one does. It's helpful to kind of just see them each working differently. Okay, so as you can see with just orbit speed, not a lot happens. It eventually will start to orbit it. And it's very slow. Even at a value of 6, it's kind of going, but it takes a little while before anything happens. And then once it starts gaining momentum, it does start getting a little bit faster. Okay, but as soon as we start adding in some suction speed, you'll see that the kind of behavior changes quite quickly. You can see that it's sucking it inwards as well as it's orbiting around. So you get a lot more wrinkles a lot more quickly. And then the last one is this lift speed, and this is literally just going to lift it upwards. So instead of it just rotating around and sucking inwards, it's actually, there we go, you can see how it's lifting the cloth up and then rotating it. And this just helped me kind of wrap it around the bottle more. So if we jump into our camera while it's doing this, without the lift, I found that it just went too low. you can see here that it's going around, but it's not actually kind of covering the bottle at all. And I found that this wasn't pleasing at all. With a little bit of this lift speed, it kind of wraps around the bottle in a really cool way that I really liked. So you can see now it's turning and then wrapping around. And now our geometry is so low that it's not looking great, but it's the effect is starting to get there. So what I'm going to do now is let's jump this up and let's add a file cache in here. All right, so that took quite a while to simulate because the cloth is so high res. So I will drop it down a little bit because I actually don't like how wrinkly it's getting here. It's folding over itself a little bit too much. So what I'm going to do is turn up this bend. So this bend stiffness is how much they can bend over each other. And if you have a really dense mesh and you want really small folds, this is great. But in this case, I don't want such a dense mesh. So I'm going to just turn it down. And that means that I can also turn this up a little bit. So maybe we go with a value of 0.3. It'll just help my simulations times just a little bit. All right, so I'm going to actually go with a value of 0.35, and then I increase the iterations just so that it's a nice smooth mesh. So let me run this sim again, and hopefully we get something a little bit better. All right, so I finished about 100 frames, and we don't actually need all of them because you'll see that this cloth actually ends up going crazy. There's the previous cache. It actually wraps around too much, and I don't want this because then you can't see the bottle at all. And so we're going to just pick a frame, maybe somewhere around here, 157, anywhere around there. And this is looking a lot better than we had before. And if you wanted it to kind of animate in and then stop, you could animate the pop axis force, and then you could add in some velocity dampening, and that would cause it to kind of go in. And then once you remove the velocity from the pop axis force, it would kind of just settle into place. So if you wanted to do that, you could change the velocity dampening here and just put a 0.1 or something. And basically that will bleed out the velocity. So when you use this, it's adding in velocity to move things around. And if you don't remove it, even once you stop this, it will keep rotating because the velocity is still there and there's nothing removing it. So it'll just keep moving in that direction. So you can then remove it with this velocity damping. But for now, we're going to just kind of look at stills. So I'm going to just pick a frame, maybe this one, and we're going to go with this. So the first thing we can do is we can drop down a clean, and we can remove everything except for our UVs. And we can drop down a null. And this is going to be our cloth. So we can do that. And OD tools, Control Shift V. And if you're new and you don't have OD tools, you can just drop down an object merge, and then you can just go and find this null over here and bring it in. And that's all that OD tools is doing. It just makes it really nice and quick. We will subdivide this, and I won't use displacement, but we'll kind of keep it at that. And we can just see what it will look like once it subdivides. It'll look like this. It looks pretty good. And what I can actually do is leave this here so that when we copy our hairs onto here, it follows the same kind of, whatever this is, the same roundness. And let's actually use a vellum post process. So instead of a subdivide, so that we can give it some smoothing. And there we go. That looks better. There's one thing here that's, these polygons are not great. And I think that's actually more to do with this clean node. Let's have a look. Yeah, that looks better. And our clean is removing this kind of, I guess it's like a normal type thing, but for now it'll be fine because we won't even see it. So what we're going to do now is we have our cloth container, and now we want to create some hair. Now we don't want to create hair everywhere because that would just use up a lot of resources. So I'm going to use my camera cull script. And if you're new, this is just something that I found online that I use all the time. And what I'll do here is just grab my camera, and then I set a value here. So this is just kind of trimming out the outer edges of my polygons. So now I just have this inside face, and you don't have to change anything else, just these parameters. So that looks good. And the next thing I can do is add a hair gen. All right, so we're going to need a lot of these. And I think eventually I ended up using something like 50,000. And we'll turn this down so it's really thin. And eventually we will want a lot more segments when we start doing some funky stuff with it. Now, as you'll see here, you can't really see anything that's going on with hair. It's one of my frustrations. And yes, you can come in here and turn on shade curves. And I don't know, supposedly this is supposed to be better. I still feel like you can't really see anything. Maybe it's a little bit better, but it's still, to me, you can't really tell what's going on. If I add a hair clump, which we will be using, you can kind of see what it's doing. I feel like you can kind of see what it's doing like this too, but it doesn't really show me enough to make some calculated decisions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the scene to render it, and then we can test out the settings while we're rendering. And I found that that's actually a much easier way to see realistically what this hair is doing. So let's split left and right. We'll grab our Redshift render view. I don't need the geometry spreadsheet anymore, and I'm going to save this. I'm also going to just render out our hair. So I'll copy this and put this over here. Turn that off. And now the thing with hair is that the old method, well, not the old method, one of the methods is you can render objects as strands. So it'll take all of these curves and it'll render them as a strip or capsule. Now, there's another way to do this, and that is render polygons as hair. Now, I've recently found out about this, and for actual hair, this ends up working a lot better. Now, this is not really hair specifically. This would be like a carpet or something, and so the strands would be very similar. But I want to show you this hair workflow because for actual hair stuff, this ends up working a lot better. I did a project recently where I needed hair, and this just absolutely outperformed the strands. There were so many issues with the strands of these kind of weird little glitches and things, and this didn't have that. It is a little bit slower because it is more physically accurate, but because of that, it does give you a lot more flexibility. So let's dive into this. First thing we need to do is create some lights. So I will create a dome light. Let's just make this yellow. And I'm just going to grab my Kino Flow, just the default light. Let's turn it off in the viewport. And then the other thing I want to do is create an RS light. And this is going to kind of be my key light. Drop that over there. And this one, I'm going to come out. Basically, what I want to do with this is I want a big softbox on the side. So I'm going to turn that off to make it a disk. So let's make it something really big, something like this. We can move it quite far away. And let's give it a value of 15 for now. All right, so something I think like that looks good. And we can rotate around our dome light when we get to it. Something I like to do with this specific dome light, I can turn this light off, turn this hair and cloth off, jump into my camera. Let's start the Redshift render view. All right, so this dome light is all we have going on now. And you can see it's kind of shining on both sides. But if I drop down a sphere, I generally do this to see what this light is doing. And let's drop this into 1. And I like to just make sure that I have these two Kino flows on each side. And so I'll leave that like that. Let me add in this light. You can't really see it doing much on this bottle, but you don't really see this bottle, so I'm not too worried about it. Let's add in our cloth and see what that does. All right, so let's just quickly create a cloth material. So we'll create a Redshift or a material builder, Redshift material builder. Let's make this whatever green, make this cloth, and I can apply it. And for the cloth, I didn't actually render it. I just kind of made it the same color as the hairs, just to kind of add a back to it, something like that. Now, of course, if you didn't want to do hairs, you could apply a cloth shader to this and it would look probably pretty cool. You can add it for now and just check it out. Yeah, and if you added in a kind of cloth shader, it would look quite cool, I think. But as I said, I didn't need to do that. I just wanted to get a color below the hair. And so I think something like this is fine. Maybe a little bit more rough. And something I want to do now is just rotate this dome light just to kind of get some light on the top of this cap. So a value of 100. Now you start to see some more light on top of this cap. All right, so something like that. Now you can kind of see, and for this cap material, I just threw on some displacement over here. And what I ended up doing is adding a mask so that I could have two different displacements, one on the bottom and this one on the top. And then when I use the displacement blender, I can have two different displacements on one geometry. And then you get the bottle and this cloth. Okay, so far that is looking good. The next thing we need to do is make a hair material. And what we're going to use here is the hair. So this is what that looks like. And we will get into these settings in a bit. Let's jump back in here and let's add our material to this hair. And then we can hit render. Okay, so let's just turn off this hair clump. Okay, I am back. And as you can see, this looks fairly terrible, but let's play with these hair settings. So it's kind of confusing at first because at the top you expect the diffuse, but it's actually this internal reflection, and the values don't always seem to make sense to me. And so I kind of just play around with them. You can see as you add in this color here, it changes things, and then this changes things. It's a bit confusing. And I guess for realistic hair, all of this stuff makes sense, but I'm not doing realistic hair. And so what I'm basically just going to use is the internal reflections and diffuse. I'm not going to use this transmission. I'm not going to use transparency. I'm just going to play with these, and let's just talk about them. So this internal reflection, as from what I understand, it is kind of like the reflection or the glossiness of it. And so yeah, we'll set that up. But what I'm going to actually use is a hair random color. So what this is going to let us do is add a random color to the hairs, and I will demonstrate that in a second. And what I'm going to do is plug it into the internal reflections color and the diffuse color. And you can see here it's taking this color. So let's just make it something crazy like a bright blue. And then if we change this now, the hue amount, you can see that it's randomly applying different hue amounts to each hair. And we can also do saturation. So some are super saturated, some are not saturated. And then there's also a value amount. So some are darker and some are lighter. Now you can go crazy with these, but we actually want it to be incredibly subtle, just so that you get these really small, subtle changes in the hair. All right, so now we have our hair kind of there, and it's looking okay. It doesn't look great, but it's looking okay. Let's just increase this glossiness, so that's a little bit less. We can pull this down, add a little bit of translucency, just so that they kind of have that inner glow. You can see now that they have this kind of like shiny look. So in general, I think this looks pretty good. Now you can of course go in and swap this and change this from not being wherever it is over here, not being this, if we're on the right container, render polygons as hairs, but you can do strands. But as I said, I found this one looked pretty cool. So let's add in some more hair gen stuff. So let's just stop that so I don't get any more crashes. And let's talk about the hair gen. So this thickness is the thickness of the hairs in the render. So when using strands, Redshift uses p-scale attribute, whereas this polygon as hairs uses this width attribute. And I think that's because this is the default attribute. So we don't have to change anything, which is quite cool. So we just set this as a really nice small number. And then here we have our density of hairs. And this is the segment. So if you have a line, it's the number of points on the line. And as you start doing crazy things like curling and bending and whatever, you need these lines to be quite high res. One of the things I found is that this doesn't subdivide. So I wasn't sure if there's a way, maybe this tessellation applies to curves. I'm not sure, but I just kind of threw extra points into my actual hairs. So we're going to play a little bit with the clump, but first let's add a frizz node. I always like adding frizz to my hair. I feel like it just gives it a little bit of a kind of natural fuzziness to it. And you can see this is a little bit wild. So let's just turn down the value. And now you can see that you just kind of get this really nice twirly behavior. So before they are just straight, and now you get this like very frizzy behavior. And if we take a render, we have a look. So this was the before, and if we add some frizz in, you can see that you can't see through anymore. So now it kind of covers it up and it gives it this really nice furry fuzzy control. What I want to do here is just play with my key light to see if we can get some slightly nicer shadows or something. It's looking a little bit flat. Maybe we can pull it back just a little bit. All right, so I like these shadows here, and then this light is just filling them all in. So I'm just going to pull this light back just so we get a little bit more shadows here. And now I can pull this around a little bit more. And again, let's just go back up to 10 and lift it up a little bit. And now this kind of wraps around and fills it out. And you get these kind of nice highlights on the top here. So we can come back into our hair, and maybe we want this to be just a little bit more saturated. Give it a bit more pop. And again, we can come in here, the translucency, if we pull this back, you can see how dark it is. And if you go full throttle, you can see it gets like really bright and you lose a lot of these shadows. But so something maybe in between, just a little bit more of this. And maybe we just do a little render region here. It is pretty slow to render it this way, but I think it looks quite cool. If we add in transmission, and sometimes it's nice to go with like a completely random color here just to see. You can see how it's kind of emitting some light into this. I guess that's what transmission is doing. And so if you wanted that, that's pretty cool. And then there's also this primary reflection, which changes it all over again. So I'm not sure why there's so many controls that completely override all the other controls, but what I'm going to do is just turn off this, make sure this is turned off, and now we get this nice furry cloth. Let me do a quick bucket render just so we can see what this looks like cleaned up. And what I'm actually going to do with this bucket render is just turn down the sampling to something like 3. So it will still clear it up a little bit faster than the progressive rendering, but it won't go to the final render. All right, so this is what we're looking like now, and I think this is quite cool. I have this nice furry carpet, and yeah, so far so good. We can make it better though. So let's jump back into our cloth here. And one of the easy things we can do here is add a length, a guide process set length. And if you want to see the hair nodes, you can, it's not actually hair, because if you go to hair, you'll see that there's hair clump and hair generate. But if you go to the guide nodes, you'll see there's guide deform, guide draw. There's all these guide nodes, and these are the ones that you can use. The ones that I use the most are these frizz ones, the guide, this length one that we're about to use now, and the guide advect and guide deform. These ones are fun if you have animations, but we are not going to talk about that today. And if that's interesting, let me know, and we can maybe cover that in another tutorial. But yeah, they're quite cool. All right, so let's jump into my camera. All right, so what this node is doing is it's setting the length. So let's get a few less here. So I have 500 hairs now, and I'm going to turn off this thing so we can see nice solid hairs. All right, so by default, the hairs are whatever the length is set here, 0.05, and now it's setting it to a length of 0.1, and you can see we can kind of grow in. What what I want to do is I want to set a randomized length so that you get some that are shorter and some that are longer. And this is the same as attribute randomize, just in the hairs. And so we know before we had 0.05, so that was our long one. So let's maybe go to 0.075, and maybe our short ones are 0.35. So just so that we get a kind of random difference between the two. All right, so it's kind of hard to see, and if we switch it off and on, you'll see it makes a really subtle difference in this. But when you start getting lots of hairs like this, it's nice to have some that are super long and some that are short. It just kind of breaks up the monotony of the same. So maybe we can even just push it a little bit more. So some are a little bit longer than others. Okay, so we'll kind of leave that in there. And now we're going to play with this hair clump node. Now I kind of like to do it in this order, but you can switch them around if you need to, if you want to frizz it up and then do clumps at the end. But I like to clump it and then set the length and then frizz it. So you can see, especially with this hair clump in, when you change the length here, you'll see that now some kind of go past the clumping. So this is the clump and then it goes past there. And I kind of like that. But if you go to 5, you see that it stays there. And if these are really short, then you get some that are shorter there. So you can kind of play with this and see what you prefer. I'm just going to go with values of 3 and 8 for now. All right, so this is quite slow. So let's just jump down to 10,000 just so we can kind of see what we're doing, and then we will push it up. Okay, so by default, this hair clump node just makes these clumps, and now we have a lot of control over these clumps. So firstly, we have the amounts that we can blend. So we can go from not really having any clumps to lots of clumps. We can change the clump size. So a really small value will make these kind of really tiny clumps, and obviously if you go too small, then you don't see anything. And you can obviously make bigger values. Let's see how big we can go. Yeah, so now you get kind of these giant clumps. And let's just go back to default here. So that's pretty cool. The other thing that's cool to play with is you can change this clump profile. So this is kind of the way that it's clumping. So it clumps in the middle and then it goes outwards at the end. So this gets you some interesting and fun results. There's also fractal. So as soon as you increase this, these unlock. And yeah, you get a lot of different types of things that you can play with here. Now it does take a bit of time, but what I really like doing is just kind of fidgeting with some of these and then rendering it. And or you can set up a cool PDG network where you just put random values in all of these and then you send it off to kind of render overnight, and you get 400 versions afterwards. I haven't done that yet, but that would be a pretty fun thing to try out. But the main thing that I really like here is this curling. Now, this kind of gives these kind of wacky and crazy results, but I think it's kind of cool. So let's just push this up and you can see it starts to curl these hairs. Let's see if we can find a cool spot here. You can start to see, so without curling, they go straight up. And then with curling, they start to bend around. And then maybe what we need to do, so maybe we turn down this frequency a little bit, or turn up the frequency. There we go. So now you can see how it's actually curling. So I just want to show you the curling. If we jump into our camera here, and let's actually just see, this frizz may be a bit too much now. Let's leave it at just a low value, just so we can see what it's looking like. Let's hit render. It looks like a desert island with little patches of grass. So it's kind of hard to see, so we'll have to just bump it up a little. Let's go up to 50,000. I'm just going to render region this because it's getting pretty slow. All right, so it's actually not covering my whole object anymore. You can see it's kind of like doing some weird stuff. All right, so I'm back after another crash. Thank you, Redshift. And you can see that this clumping here is kind of, I guess it's going beneath the cloth, or I don't know, it's doing some crazy weird stuff where it's blocking it off, and I don't like that so much. So I'm going to turn down this frequency so that it's not so intense. So we get this nice curling. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to reduce this to something really low. Let's go even lower, maybe 3. I just don't want to see so many like hardcore clumps. And then we can also change the clump size a little bit. So now we start to see kind of these little clump patterns. And when we add frizz in, it just kind of breaks them up a little bit. Let's add a little bit more frizz. Let's hit render and see what we get. All right, so this is pretty much the same settings that I used for this image over here. And I think what I need to do in this example is just change this underlying cloth to be a little bit darker so that it doesn't poke through as much. But you can start to see now, and we can maybe just render a little section here. You can start to see now how you get these like really nice little clumps, and you can start to change things and get some crazy cool variety of shapes and patterns and these cool little hairs. But if you have a look here at the top, I love how kind of frizzy these are, and there's just like these little strands sticking out, and it looks really good. And this section here looks super full and fluffy and fun, and I really liked this look. So let's quickly jump into our shader and see if there's anything here that we want to change. We can maybe give a little bit more randomness to the saturation and maybe even the hue amount, just so that we get some that are desaturated, some that are more saturated. Even the value amount. Let's push this a little bit, and maybe we can pull this back a little bit now. That was good. And then here. And now it's just a matter of playing with the different settings and lighting and stuff and just seeing what you can get. This was a slightly shorter tutorial than normal, and that's on purpose because sometimes it's fun just to play with like these small little things and just throw simple scenes together and play and have fun and make something cool rather than getting so super technical and nitty gritty. And so I hope you enjoyed this like simpler one. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you soon for another one, and maybe we'll get more technical. See you then.